Lerine, and I'm very pleased to introduce her. Annemarie Weyl Carr is Professor Emerita of Art History. She's an art historian at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas. She studied at the Michigan University and received her PhD. She's a real specialist of Byzantine period, Byzantine art history, especially church paintings. She has published several books and articles. I cannot mention it, but today's topic, Asinou, across time. This is her passion, I think, most important. She's still writing other books, but this book, Asinou, she was so kind to present me a copy of this book, and but it will be present in this university among my private books here, and this book is most important book about the church paintings in Cyprus. This is indeed a reference book, we have to say. Why? Because Panagia Phorbiotissa, this church is very well preserved, firstly, and the church paintings, the program of the church painting is almost entirely preserved. This is a rare case, and these are from the different periods. We have from the 12th century, Middle Age, and the later periods, 14th and 16th centuries. The students are this chance to study the changing styles at this church, and this church is also very well studied. I mean, this is monumental book, and there are other publications, of course, on this church. And another reason why this church is such important, it is among the 9 churches in Troodos mountain range, which were added in the list of UNESCO as most important churches of Cyprus. I recommend you to visit it. It's not far. It is, I think, 40 minutes from Nicosia by driving. There are other beautiful churches, of course, but we should definitely go there with our students. Panagia Phorbiotissa, Phorbiotissa in Greek speech. Who was she? Who was this? The Mother Goddess with a special name. This is actually a botanic name. It is, in English, it's Phorbiotissa. So, how it's called? The plant.
It's the spurges.
Spurge, exactly. And in German, it's Wolfsmilch. Wolfsmilch. In Türkçe, sütleyen. I had never heard this. But it's interesting, in German and in Turkish, it has something to do with milk. Sütleyen. There are, I think, poisony versions and good versions. Anyhow, sütleyen, sporch in English. Yeah, and this Panagia, Virgin Mary has this epitheton. For whatever reason, maybe you will tell us about it. Yeah. An extraordinary book because it is fully published. This is, I think, the first and only monographic create a publication of a well-preserved church. Whoever is working on churches should consult this work. And I'm very happy that we have now in this site this book. Thank you very much, Annemarie. And thank you very much for coming here. Another thing I have to mention here, she's an extraordinary person helping to other people, other scholars who are unaware of certain things, like I am. I'm now, as most of you know, I'm now involved in research of a church in my own village. And I wrote an article on this because I'm not an art historian, I'm an archaeologist. I'm a specialist of Hellenistic period or even earlier period, but not in church paintings, but not in church architecture. I sent this article to review Annemarie, and she immediately reacted, and she motivated me, she encouraged me to do more research on it. The more I read and the more I was in contact with her, and the more I was encouraged to study, I became now a church person myself in my old age. But I'm very grateful to you for coming and for encouraging me. Thank you very much for this again. Thank you.
Oh, goodness. And thank you, Latife, for a beautiful introduction. And thank you for your interest in that church, because, of course, I do love the churches. And it is just so lovely to see one of these just come to life. So this really is wonderful. But I thank all of you for being here. And it really is a pleasure to be able to share with you thoughts about the paintings at the Church of the Panagia Phorbiotissa, which, whoops, oh, sorry, yes, put that, yes, there we go. Yeah, which is, you can see there where it is just at the foothills of the Troodos Mountains. Familiarly, it is known as Asinou, after the now vanished village of Asinou, which was near to it. Built in the early 12th century, when Cyprus was still part of the Byzantine Empire, it is now a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. In making our virtual visit this evening, we'll be joining some 50,000 people who ordinarily visit him as tourists each year, and thousands more who come as pilgrims. And the number there, I think, gives a sense of the greatness of the building. And yet, great as it is, it itself is just small. I mean, really, it's more a churchlet than it is a church. Now, and what I hope now I can do this evening is just to give you a sense of what it is that really makes Asinou so very special, because certainly it is to me. From the early 12th century until the end of the 18th century, Asinou was a monastic site. And I think actually, as one comes to it there on the lip of a mountain valley, in its isolation, and just, you don't even need to go into the church. It just invites you to sort of settle into the quietness and leave the hubbub of everyday life behind. It may not have been quite so isolated when it was first built, however, because a high hill is right behind you from this photograph that commands an extraordinary view up the north coast of Cyprus, ideal for military surveillance. And it may, in fact, have been through military surveillance that the patron of the church, a certain Lord Nikephoros Isterios came to know the site and to be attracted to it. Now, as you see the church here in Nikephoros' hands, the church was initially just the right part of it, and just a kind of barrel-vaulted box about 9 meters long with an apse at the eastern end. And yet that small little hub negotiated a long life that just remade itself time and again. And in the course already of the 12th century, a narthex was added with apses on both ends. And yet later, structural reinforcements were needed, a kind of flying buttress that reinforced weaknesses in the north wall that destabilized the vault, and actually the original apse even fell. Now, captivating as the setting of Asinou is, I think its greatness in the end does lie in its interior. And the interior of both the narthex, where you're standing here, and the nave and apse here is covered with frescoes. And the earliest, sponsored by Lord Nikephoros himself, date to 1105-6, but his was only the first of many fresco campaigns. And rich as tapestries and just as warm as an old sweater, those frescoes have shaped and reshaped the building's space. Looking in this way from the western entrance toward the east is probably the classic view for any longitudinal space. And yet, in the end, this probably was the first view of Asinou's inside for very few people. In fact, today, it still is true that by and large, people come in through the south door, which is right there, facing it toward the northern wall here. This accords with the character of a Byzantine church, which really is not so much a path as it is a kind of pool of space in front of the sanctuary, ringed by sacred figures. Now, the original main entrance into the church actually was not even the south entrance, but probably was the north door, which you're seeing there, because that looks out on what used to be the monastic buildings. So that's where the monks, by and large, would have been coming in. But in any case, the entrance into the church really was on this kind of axis, rather than the path-like axis that we tend to think about. And once inside, visitors just reveal immediately whether they have come to Asinou to venerate the holy figures, or whether they've come to Asinou to venerate the art. And the Orthodox pilgrim, responding instinctively to the gesture of the saints, will move slowly clockwise toward the right to honor the sanctuary and one by one the saints who stand before it. And you can see how the gestures think already of the Saints Theodore here, sort of lead one's eye onward toward the sanctuary barrier, starting with the figure of St. John the Baptist, then Mary, the Mother of God, both of them in turn toward Christ. And the triad there constitutes what is known in Greek as the diesis, that is the intercession. And as Christ, as the sort of two human beings closest to Christ in all the world, plead with him for mercy toward human beings, which of course responds to the pleas of the venerating pilgrim. And so from the Baptist and Mary and Christ, the icon itself They go on toward the figures on the south wall. First of all, again, Mary, and then St. George and St. Eustratius, and so back again to the saints on the north wall where they'd begun. Most of the saints here, like the Saints Theodore and George, are courtly warriors. The painter underscores the sort of continuity of the sequence of saints by continuing the ripple of the little arches over the sanctuary barrier along over the saints and around the whole central bay, just as if sort of embracing the pilgrim in a space enclosed by holy protection. Now, the movement of those who have come to venerate art is very different. And the paintings that we're looking at here were actually painted in the 14th century, between about pretty much in the 1340s. After the structural weaknesses of the north wall had required the installation of thicker piers inside and reinforcing transverse arches to reinforce the vault. And of course, these introductions then scarred the walls, destroyed the paintings, and the space needed to be repainted. And it was repainted in the 1340s. In many cases, the painting of the 1340s actually covered over the original 12th century paintings. And in fact, if you look, for instance, at St. Nicholas, right over here, and you can see that there are still 12th century paintings where the new layer has broken off. Now, the 12th century painter here was a great artist. He is known as the Asinou master. And who he was and where he came from, whether it was Constantinople or Cyprus or the royal court of Georgia, is very much debated today. But his work is best visible now in the Western Bay, which wasn't affected by the structural problems. And so that the visitors who come to the art immediately turn their backs to the sanctuary in order to look toward the Western wall and see the art by the Asinou master. The Asinou master's stature, I think, really comes especially clearly out in the scene which dominates the Western wall. And this is the falling asleep in death of the Mother of God, in Greek, the chemesis. And the chemesis shows Christ as he comes to her deathbed to take her soul immediately from her deathbed to heaven. And the chemesis is one of the profound feasts of the Orthodox Church, and its stately composition, drawing upon Greek funerary imagery as ancient as the Dipylon vase, it sort of captures the profundity, and I think is conveyed in the stark geometries of the Asinou master's composition, with its three squares sort of converging upon the relentless cruciform of Christ and his mother, where literally just X marks the spot right there in the middle. But the chemesis was also a deeply profound devotional scene around which many emotions eddied, from the grief of loss and departure to the consoling anticipation of salvation. And tides of emotional participation sweep the Asinou master's stark geometries also. And in a sense, like heavy seas, the surging grief of the apostles sort of sweeps in from the left and breaks against the solemnity of God and his mother, and then ripples on in the sort of lapping back and forth of heads and garments on the other side. Unusually confined to the stately reserve of male grief, the scene receives in the Asinou master's hands also several women figures who sort of reinforce the emotional character of the scene. And the gestural intensity of the scene interacts powerfully with its geometric core in much the way in which the surging expressiveness of heads and bodies is smoothed then by the smooth bluntness of the shapes and the colors. And John Pope Hennessy at one point remarked of Piero della Francesca's art that the shapes and colors share a perfect consonance of soft, smooth bluntness. I think a very similar consonance of shape and color characterizes also the Asinou master's art. I think you can feel very well in details of the garments. Now, the echimesis is often placed, as it is here, on the western wall, and yet its sheer grandeur here makes it stand out as if it's important to this place. And it seems to alert oneself to the possibility of a funerary element in the church. The Asinou master's emotive force, I think, is also felt well in the image which is right beside the echimesis, which is tucked in there. And this scene shows the 40 martyrs of Sebaste. And once again, the 40 martyrs are sort of holy warriors. They're a company of Roman soldiers frozen to death on a lake for refusing to honor the Roman gods. Naked, shivering, their broken skin bleeding, their footprints bloody on the snow, they're shown as men of many different ages and dispositions to evoke the empathy of many different kinds of people. Between their suffering together and then the descending crowns of their martyrdom at the top, there is inscribed a poem. And winter brings the pain, fresh flesh the sufferings here. If you pay attention, you will even hear the groans of the martyrs. But if you do not listen, they will still endure the violence of the cold, looking to their crowns and not to their toils. And the poem gives the image a voice in speaking to you as you and inviting you not just to see, but to feel and to hear. But that its viewers have indeed responded keenly is shown in the sort of dark red blotches that you see here. And these are not paint, and this is paint, that's showing the blood, but this is actually created by votive candles, which were affixed to the surface of the fresco, and their flames darkened the ochre of the pigment, so that I'm literally sort of touched by devotion. And the scene is literally touching. People have really responded to it. And poems like the one that you see here were actually composed in Byzantium quite often for works of art, but very rarely do we ever find one of them still on an actual work of art. And Asinou stands out in having at least the remains of 7 such poems. And obviously, Lord Lycophorus liked poetry. I think there's another poem on the wall that just looks directly toward this one along here, in which an inscription again speaks to the viewer, saying that the Church of the Holy Mother of God was painted through the donation and great desire of Nikephoros Magistros Iskyrios when Alexius Komnenos was emperor in the year 6614 in diction 14, that is 1106. And Nikephoros has in fact ringed the little church with his names. And he was most visible in the central bay. And here again, we're back in the central bay and facing that south door where most people now come in. The monks who entered Asinou, on the other hand, from their monastic buildings, entered through the north door with this wall in front of them. And directly ahead, in what is, in a sense, the icon on this wall, just as the chemosis is on the western wall, the patron Nikephoros stands full length, presenting the image of his church to a looming figure of the Mother of God. And the composition was overpainted again in the 14th century. It no longer has the cool, blunt tones of the Asinou master, and I'm quite sure that initially it probably looked rather different than it does now. But at its heart, what can only be a close copy of a 12th century man of eminence holding the church in its 12th century form without the narthex, an aristocrat attired in court attire. Nikephoros himself must have chosen the courtly martyrs who ring the space below him. Before him is his most extensive poem, and it addresses Mary. Having been blessed in life with many good things of which thou, O Virgin, was seen to be provided, I, Nikephoros Magistros, a wretched suppliant, erected this church with devotion, in return for which I seek to find thee my champion at the terrible day of judgment. So in a sense, with this sort of even-handed expectation of a man used to authority, Nikephoros offers his church to the Virgin and asks in return salvation. It's an exchange. But behind Nikephoros stands the church's most enigmatic image, a small figure, and clearly labeled by both her headdress and her inscription as female, and yet unaccountably dressed in the same male court costume as Nikephoros himself. One would expect her to be his wife, and yet a Cypriot painting doesn't show a wife smaller than her husband. So, and who this is a conundrum. I think the 14th century painter seems to have understood her as Nikephoros' daughter. And certainly her jeweled headdress, which is that of a 14th century princess, must have been given her by the 14th century painter. It may also have been he who was responsible for her red slippers, because those are so reminiscent of the red shoes that were worn by the Byzantine emperors that they have tricked even very distinguished modern scholars into believing that she belonged to the imperial family, which in fact is a distinction much too high for Nikephoros' title of Magistros. Her name is Yaphira, and the inscription records her death. And her death and Nikephoros' concern with salvation resonate with the imposing image of the chemosis behind them and make it hard not to believe that this church was perhaps built to house her or their tomb. We don't know literally whether Nikephoros built the building as a personal mausoleum or as a monastic building. It is clear, however, that it found continued life after his death as a monastery. And it's that which accounts for the narthex. This is part of monastic architecture. Then toward the end of the 12th century, late in the 12th century, a new patron of wall painting appeared, once again named Nikephoros. Since he was not a monk, but a layperson, he focused his patronage in the narthex, commissioning a huge mural icon of St. George in the South Apse. And mounted on a brilliant white horse, the figure of George is thrilling. And like Nikephoros Iskyrios, this Nikephoros also left a dedicatory inscription, but unlike the Magistros, he does not identify himself with reference to the court in Constantinople. Instead, he identifies himself, as you can see there, as a horse physician. He's a horse doctor. And actually, Latife brought out these spurges, and that is a plant which is used for feeding horses. And it's been suggested by people who have looked carefully at the costumes of the monks, whom we'll be seeing shortly, which are split, that they may have been raised horses there with these pastors around Asinou. But when Nikephoros first put the St. George, well, I think first of all, I think that as a physician of horses, I think one can imagine his being enchanted by that great big white horse of St. George, and in fact, the face of the horse is marvelously characterful. And you can see also the fine detail with which he surrounds the face of George. And the surface modulation of George's face has worn off, but still the sort of infallibility of the artist's brush can be felt very well in the contours, which have a kind of innate vitality that is felt really throughout the entire composition. Now, when that was first painted, it stood alone in the narthex. So far as we can tell, there were no other paintings at this point in the narthex. Sconces were fixed into the wall on either side of the painting in order to hold lamps or candles. And you can imagine it must have been quite a focal point for people coming in to the narthex, and attracted its own pilgrims. And in fact, one of them even did make his own graffito. He signed himself down here. His name again is Nikephoros. He's Nikephoros Kalia, Nikephoros who puts horseshoes on horses. So there's this kind of horsey theme that comes in here. But I think that the icon of St. George shows us how the foundation of Nikephoros Iskyrios went on after Nikephoros' life to find sophisticated and substantial patrons in the local community who may not have had courtly connections as Nikephoros did, couldn't afford a whole institution, but certainly could make generous bequests to a monastery that was important to him. But with the work of the St. George and the work of the Asinou master, we've seen what the name Asinou, by and large, stands for. These are what identify the monument as a work of great Byzantine art. But in no sense do they begin to exhaust the historical value of the building. And we do, in this sense, feel a kind of sea change. The adornment of the narthex, which begins so splendidly with the St. George, doesn't get continued. No more 12th century paintings of that period. Bad things happen to the church. The conch of the apse collapsed. The main vault became unstable, and reinforcements scarred the paintings. We don't know exactly when these happen. It's reasonably certain that the recurrent earthquakes of the 13th century certainly caused them to happen. But it's hard to dissociate their sense of catastrophe from the century's historical events, too. Because in 1191, and literally probably just years after the St. George, Cyprus was conquered by the Crusades and became the seat of a Crusader kingdom ruled by French Catholic kings. And the seismic violence of nature forms a kind of sort of physical correlative to the deep social dislocations that accompanied the implantation of the Latin regime. And Latin, because for the Crusaders, the language of worship was Latin, as Greek was for the Cypriot majority. And the local aristocracy, by and large, fled the island, leaving institutions like Asinou to fend for themselves. Now, how Asinou actually did this is recorded in the murals of the narthex, and they registered the resumption of patronage, and with it, the story not so much anymore of Byzantium, but of Cyprus's own social relocation as a Crusader kingdom. A patronage began piecemeal, not with one big, large program, but image by image. One can see the sequence from the way in which their edges overlap. It seems to have begun with this figure. Her name is Anastasia Saramalina, after a local town, Saramala. She herself has portrayed herself here with her namesake, Saint Anastasia, the poison curer. She's right beside the St. George, as if almost eschewing the broad, empty walls elsewhere in the narthex in order to tuck herself in underneath the flying cloak of St. George. Her own cloak adheres to Cypriot styles, but her headdress with its little pillbox hat actually reflects Latin fashions. A mature and competent of mien, Anastasia Saramalina was probably a major figure in Asinou's history, and her patronage did not provide the kind of jewel colors that her predecessors, or that her more wealthier predecessors had. And you can see the difference of the ultramarine blue and brilliant red in the George, and her own much more somber colors. Nonetheless, the sort of sweet, pungent, personal style of the painter whom she employed appears again in the paintings of the restored apse. So it may have been Anastasia who underwrote the repairs to the building, and her support may have set the little community once again on the road to renewed prosperity. Well, the next evidence of patronage is, interestingly, once again from a woman. And she too sponsored her portrait with her chosen saint, the Mother of God, and her two young sons. And she kneels in the conch above St. George. Her scarlet clothing, so different from that of Anastasia, identifies her as a Latin, not a local person, and in fact as a lady. And like Nikephoros Iskyrios, she's an aristocrat, portrayed without her spouse, no doubt as a Crusader widow whose fief must have adjoined Asinou. Her nobility serves to bind her not to the outside world as Nikephoros' had, but rather to bind her to a life within Cyprus. And we know that women, particularly among the Latin nobility, were drawn to the intimacy and privacy of these small Orthodox churches. And it's striking to see that she, and no less than the native Anastasia, contributed to the monastery here. And the imagery that she uses with the Virgin spreading out her cloak protectively really echoes beautifully the spreading cloak of St. George just beneath her. And yet it is in fact a Latin image, used among others by Duccio in a well-known Sienese painting. And she herself is poignantly portrayed, slender, young, and still touchingly beautiful. Then in 1332-33, for the first time since 1105-6, a full-blown mural program was undertaken once again, and the entire narthex was frescoed. Now, in a monastic church where the nave and sanctuary were accessible only, almost exclusively, to monks only, it was really the narthex that provided the focus for the devotional activities of the people in the surrounding communities. And the adornment of the narthex, in essence, tells us that the institution here, once reliant on the personal patronage of the local big men, had now secured the loyalty and support of the community round about. The program which they installed at this point is a particularly interesting and thoughtful one. And we'll look at 4 of its features. And in the first place, I think it's really striking that without compromising them in any way, it embraces and integrates all of the earlier images, and not just of St. George and of the local Anastasia, but even the Latin Lady are all incorporated into this cloak of color that embraces the whole. Secondly, I think it's striking that the program here capitalizes upon the narthex's dome to restore the central focus of the narthex space, a space that had been pulled very strongly toward the south because of the St. George. Now, in the dome is, of course, Christ, the all-ruler, the Pantocrator. And the Pantocrator constitutes the most usual crowning image of the nave in a Byzantine church. And I think with this, the narthex proclaims itself a holy space like a nave. And in a sense, it is the holy space of the local community who participate in this church. Then I think a third feature of the program that makes the composition of the dome especially intriguing is that the dome portrays the Last Judgment. And Christ in the dome is surrounded in the pendentives by the 12 apostles, who of course sit in judgment with him at the Last Judgment. And between them and over the western door on the wall that is just up here, you can see the prepared throne for the judging Christ with Adam and Eve and angels on one side and the river of fire intended for the damned on the other side. And if in fact you do look, as a poor photograph here endeavors to, at the fire prepared for the damned, you will see among them 2 clergymen, bishops, who wear what look very much like the mitres of Latin bishops, and either Latin bishops or maybe even Orthodox bishops who had submitted to the customs of the Latin Church. The punishments of the damned are very graphically spelled out along the archivolt here over the arch where the St. George and the Anastasia and so were. And I'm really laying out the sins of local people. And these are regional people. And here the man who plows over boundaries. Here the false miller with his millstones around his neck. And the thief, the slanderer, with his tongue being bitten, the falsifier of weights, the bad nun who is love's gospel, presumably having her ears bitten, the renegade monk, and behind him, the woman who aborts her children. They are those really the sins of a working community. And I think it makes one reflect that in the 12th century, Lord Nikephoros had asked for Mary's help at the Last Judgment. And in concrete and intense terms here, one sees very clearly what lies ahead in the Last Judgment for the sort of everyday life that people here were living. And it really is with the community here that I think the program has its fourth and most intriguing aspect. And that is the sense of community that really belongs to it. I think when one feels this in the choice of the saints who are shown here, because they are overwhelmingly local saints and not courtly saints, not courtly warriors. And some of them, in fact, very specifically Cypriot saints. I think particularly a figure who stands out very much is the one who is where the arrow points. She is Irene, who was the daughter of Saint Spiridon. This is literally the only image we know of Saint Irene, and yet she figures quite consistently in the stories of Saint Spiridon's life. So she's absolutely a figure and a holy figure, but she's a local Spiridon is a local figure, and she's a very local saint. But I think even more specifically than the local saints is the fact that the murals embrace fewer than a further 10 full-length portraits of named persons who must have participated in sponsoring the program. I think especially striking is the tall monk. Well, you can really hardly see him, but I think you'll see him better here, who's here in the archivolt of the entrance into the naos. He's identified as Theophilus. He's identified as a monk of this monastery, and he was also dead before he was portrayed here. And I think what stands out about Theophilus is his hunting dogs. And we know that Cypriots adored hunting. And we do know that certain of the Cypriot clerics allowed themselves their hunting dogs, even though their monastic state should not have permitted them, just the way Chaucer's monk allowed himself his hunting dogs. And one sort of guesses that probably Theophilus was the same way. He had his hunting dogs. And if so, he probably also was a man probably of fair wealth. So interesting. Then along with Theophilus, 6 other monks are portrayed. And you can see one of them here. All of them raise their hands, and all of them sort of extend their hands over the frames as if really sort of belonging to the real space in which they stand. And it could well be that the monks portrayed here actually does show the population of the monastery at this point. 6 monks, a seventh one deceased, and 6 monks would be a respectable population in a monastery. But there are not only monks portrayed here, but there are also lay people. There are 2 gentlemen, 2 portrayed men here who do not wear monastic garb. They must be fairly established members of the community. And like Anastasia's pillbox and the little white hat of the man there, again, is a carryover from Latin fashions. Then the 10th portrait in the program is once again a woman. You can see her, and you can see her past Anastasia and Irene, then she's over there. She also is shown with her patron saint, in this case, Anna, and her name is Anna, Anna Lache. And she's a really fabulous figure, sort of succulent features with beautifully embroidered garments, of course, very much the kind of embroidery that one still sees in Cyprus. And what is particularly striking about Anna is her name, because Lache is the name of was the name of an extremely wealthy merchant family of Nestorian Syrians, immigrants in Cyprus. And along with crusaders, many Syrian Christians fled to Cyprus during the 13th century. And if Anna was indeed associated with the famous Lache family, she forms a fascinating triad with Anastasia and the Latin lady, in the sense that here Latin, Greek, and Syrian, noble, gentry, and merchant, and they represent a remarkable cross-section of the creeds, nationalities, and classes that came together in medieval Cyprus. And they form one of the most powerful images that we have of the remarkable convergence of peoples who came together to create the sort of 14th century kingdom of Cyprus. I think it's interesting to compare the narthex on the one hand, on the right, and the interior of Asinou. And both are spaces cloaked in imagery by the gift of people who had made the little building a spiritual focus in their lives. And both evoke the fear of judgment at the end of their lives. Where Nikephoros, however, had made an individual gift, the people in the narthex made a communal one, sharing both the expense of the work and their exposure as donors. Where Nikephoros offers his church as a gift to Mary and to an honor guard of courtly warriors, the people in the narthex called upon local saints, in some cases, saints unique to the island. Where Nikephoros offered his gift as a form of negotiation, anticipating support at the end of time, the people in the narthex offer only their entreaties. And in this sense, the two really belong to 2 different worlds, and yet they're bridged by their shared life in the one church. Only in response to one other fundamental challenge was wall painting introduced once again to Asinou. And this followed the conquest of Cyprus in 1570-71 by the Ottomans. A small image of Emmanuel in a chalice adorns the vima. It's behind, really sort of behind where the icon is there. And tiny as it is, however, it is like the program in the narthex, a response on the part of a whole community. And beneath the chalice are 20 signatures, including that of Christodoulos, the Archbishop of Cyprus between 1609 and 1640. And it must have been these people who helped to redeem the monastery's property after the catastrophic extension to Cyprus in 1585 of Sultan Selim II's command that Orthodox monasteries buy back their own lands. For 3 decades thereafter, the Church of Cyprus struggled to meet that demand. Thanks to Christodoulos and his fellow signatories, Asinou was able to do so. Confirmed in its land, the little monastery continued its life for centuries, though slowly ebbing now as economies changed and rural populations slipped toward the cities. And we last hear of the monastery in the pages of Archimandrite Kyprianos in 1788. It no longer appears in the Episcopal Register of 1825. Thereafter, its life was stilled, and history has possessed it since. And its protection now is in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annemarie, for this fascinating paper. I'm really overwhelmed with all these images, wonderful colors. And yeah, I can imagine that there are some questions, comments, impressions. What's fascinating is the coexistence of Latins and Orthodox
Isn't it intriguing? And of course, it is so, because you have this sort of marvelous community, and then you've got those bishops up there in the choir, and you can feel that all things aren't totally harmonious. And when I started being interested in sort of mixed communal kind of research, I sort of always thought, I'd find the heavenly community where everybody got along. But it's amazing how inclusive that program is, and yet there's also a little bit of in the bishops.
Professor Latife, thank you very much for your preparing. That was very useful. Thank you very much for your kind information.
Yeah.
That was very useful for me. Annemarie Weyl Carr, Merve Senem Arkan, this church, as far as my experiences, looks very unique. I mean, if we can compare with the other church.
For its architecture or paper?
Yes, as a building, very, very unique. This is one I got it important about it. And as far as I know, geographically, it's not far away from Giko Monastery. It's very mixed. And the question, why Giko Monastery is more, I can't say more important, but more famous than this little church. This is one. The second question is, inside of the church, I mean the frescoes or the icons or the pictures, they are all mixed. Seems to be too complicated. I mean, too different. I mean, many differences.
Yeah.
It gives different, ideas. So in little church, how all this happened? I mean, why they needed to put them all in? So I noticed there are, how can I say, evidence that it is Egyptian. There are also evidences Arab, period. And also there are other pictures where it's general. I mean, we can see the same pictures or items in the other church as well.
Yeah.
And also in this little small church, why all these pictures, needs to be put there? To throw them there. What was the main reason?
No, I think, and this first question is really fascinating because I think the question that really hangs over Asinou is what was bringing people to Asinou? This little tiny thing sitting there, what was, and we don't really understand, but it is the sort of one of the churches of the Mother of God that is in the vicinity. And you're right, I've never juxtaposed the fact that one has there in the 12th century Kikos way up on the top, which has its imperial icon.
Yes, but the Kikos,
But Asinou
yes,
has its imperial patron, who's really filling it with vitality, and then I think I still would love to know what it was that was drawing pilgrims there.
Many travelers, where they travel in Cyprus, they prepare to travel and visit Giko Monastery, not that one.
Yes. Why? Yes, I mean, and I think that actually, I think Kikos did not really become a pilgrimage site until it was very deliberately shaped to be a pilgrimage site by Gregorios, the hegumen, who was hegumen at the time of the Ottoman conquest.
You mean Gregorios, the Archbishop of Constantinople?
No, he was just he was the hegumen of the Igumenos of Kikos at the time that he had to reconstitute the monastery after the Ottoman conquest, and he makes a presentation.
Conquest, you mean which conquest? The Venetian?
In 1570-71.
So
in 1570-71, and he actually makes a statement to the Diwan of Cyprus, to the mullahs, in which he says that you have told me that the property which in our day had been important to the monastery are still important to the monastery, but we are going to make them available to pilgrims and to travelers, and we are going to, and in a way he almost uses the language of a Waqf institution. And I think it really, in a sense, is the reshaping of Kikos at this point, that it becomes then a major pilgrimage.
Yeah, and also about the restoration and conservation of the items inside. I mean, the frescoes. I mean, who made them?
The Americans, Dumbarton Oaks in the 60s.
Yes.
That's why all Americans are involved in the research of this church.
You look at you
Right in the 60s.
You concentrate the historical background of the church, just Nikephoros.
Mm-hmm.
I think this church has been before Nikephoros and after Nikephoros.
Not really for him. Well, this is the beginnings of that inscription about these people have picked away at it, and in the end he does say that he built it. So it's for the longest time we've itched about this question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
But you are indeed addressing a question.
That juxtaposition, because I work on Kikos, that's what I'm working on right now, and that juxtaposition is that's just like that just jumps right onto the point. That is a fascinating question.
Still, I wonder. I mean, why they brought for example, the icon Anna, Saint Virgin Maria, ξέρεις. Πρώτα έφεραν αυτόν τον τρόπο, ύστερα έγιναν, πώς να σου πω, το μεγαλύτερο εκκλησία, εντάξει. First they brought from Russia, the Virgin Mary's, icon, and make it very famous. And so afterwards located everything. I mean, all the activities of the church in Giko. But it was more important buildings, I mean, churches than Giko in Cyprus.
Yes.
I also know if you
absolutely. Yes.
Yes.
But that's a question. What is important? Which church is important? Whose value it is? The values are changing.
Yes.
It's same in Panagia Phorbiotissa. The travelers didn't visit this church, and we don't have even a documentation of this miraculous mosaics because they didn't see it as worth to document at all. But in my opinion, it's the most important church of all Cyprus. Of course, they're valuing the monuments.
It's very important because
But it is indeed important. But the earliest documentation of this church we have from late 50s and 60s. It is incredible. Changing values. This is a topic indeed, which should be.
No, it is.
Is
so
it politics? Is it? I don't know what.
And even very major monasteries like Carapatria, like Saint Nicholas of the Roof of Tistegis, is the 18th centuries when you will finally have written testimony.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
thank you.
Listen, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You are willing for this little island, and you implement something which is so valuable for us.
Yeah,
so
we are honored having a scholar like this. Yeah. Any other question, comment?
Thank you.
Yes.
My
knowledge of Byzantine art and painting is very superficial, so I would like to ask if this Asinou master that you mentioned is also active elsewhere in Cyprus, if some traces have been...
Yeah, I'm going to come close to that because I don't hear very well.
The Asinou master, have you, are there traces elsewhere in Cyprus?
Actually, yes. We have what we certainly again we argue among ourselves is this Asinou master or this is his workshop, but we have at Monagri. There are images that are very close to at the Joachim and Anna in Kalyana are the 40 Martyrs is there, and then Tricamo is certainly his workshop.
Okay.
And then
I will have a look because I live very close by to Tricamo.
Yeah.
I have seen Asinou. Now I understand it better. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I will have a look to Tricamo.
Yes.
Very soon.
Because Tricamo is really a beautiful program. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what is your opinion and feeling about, you mentioned that Cyprus is being the bridge interlinked between all the Latin, the Greek, and obviously before that. What is your personal experience, feeling, and opinion upon this interconnection, this link of this specific, obviously, location, and your personal experience of your studies on the island? How would you react to this?
For me, I guess in terms of sort of interaction among people, I think Cyprus is such a gorgeous instance of people coming together and making something really come alive. And it's to me, I love being here on that very basis. But I think that it is also true that, and again, you will find the things like the hierarchs who are there in the fire, that there are points where the juncture has problems, But no, in terms of Cyprus's ability to draw together, I find it just a remarkable place, and I really have enormous respect for the people of Cyprus who do this.
As you mentioned, I think so. Now it is as an ability to bridge all this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, yes, you're a remarkable people.
Thank you.
Really are. Yeah. No, it is such a relief right now to be out of my own country, where it's just pulling itself to pieces.
Hope not.
To come to a reasonable society where people can go with masks and shop without having temper tantrums. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't think I need the microphone.
I don't know if...
Okay. Thank you very much. I've learned a great deal this afternoon about what I call late Byzantine wall paintings. And I know absolutely nothing about them, so it was great to learn something. But I have a question. To me, the 40 Martyrs of Sebastia seemed an odd choice for a remote monastery chapel in the hills of central Cyprus, or were they so popular that they appeared everywhere?
Actually, they were very popular here, but I think that it is true that Nikephoros was very conscious of his connection with the court in Constantinople, and these warrior saints were great favorites of the court. And you see them in the Constantinopolitan churches, and of course Constantinople was the center of a major empire, and it had its armies, and its saints of the armies, and these were deeply patriotic also, and so that Nikephoros, I think, is gathering his sort of his honor guard of warrior saints, which accompanies his nobility.
I'm just rather jealous that the 40 Saint Martyrs of Sebastia became so famous, and people rather forget about the 42 Martyrs of Amorium.
Yes, and the Martyrs of Sebastia, and people will can find churches where, and they'll really work to manage to get in roundels over archivolts, and so to get enough roundels in to get 40 martyrs. Because
42 was too many. Then.
Yeah, I guess. But it isn't. I'm not. And of course, the 40 Martyrs did have a great church father who wrote their first great funerary statement about their death, was Gregory of Nyssa.
Yeah.
So that they have this very powerful voice behind them. Yeah.
No comments?
I would like to say thank you very much indeed. I really enjoy it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yeah.
I'm so pleased to meet you again.
And yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
It's my pleasure.
It was really a great presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Annemarie, and to see how she's fascinated by this church, and we are now motivated to go there and visit.
I would like to thank you very, very much as well, because I found that it was also a very human presentation, which is very important for us to understand and for people to understand. Byzantium is complicated for people that are not Orthodox.
Yes.
And I understand the question very much of why do you need all these same Panagias? You have 40 Panagias in one church.
Yes.
I remember I took some Turkish Cypriot friends of mine to Asinou.
Yeah.
You know that I do.
Yeah.
I take Greek Cypriots and I talk to them about the monuments. And once I took Turkish Cypriot friends to Asinou and then to Arakas. And the question was yours.
Yes.
Why do you need it? Why do you need to have all these representations?
Yeah.
Multiplication.
Multiplication of it's the same thing. It's the same Ios Nikolaos and it's the same Ios Georgios and it's
Yes, but Anna, you see, during the Venetian, the Catholics, you know what happened to the Orthodox in that time, in that period?
Yeah, we're talking much earlier than that.
No, I'm talking about the
14th century.
about 16th century.
Yeah. But this is earlier. This is 11th. This is 12th century.
No, 16th century, when the Ottomans arrived
Yeah.
to Cyprus, they stopped all this rebellion, this conflict, and they gave facilities to the Orthodox Church.
I think
You know that?
everybody knows that. Everybody knows that after the Orthodox Church felt oppressed by the Latins, they found a way. They
Yeah.
found a modus vivendi,
Yes.
right? They found.
And the Ottomans
you know,
plus they
Panagiottis?
they give
Lambadistis?
privileges to the
They gave
Orthodox.
privileges
Yes.
to the Orthodox,
Yes.
the Ottomans. We know that.
Yes.
This is very important for the Greek Cypriots to know and acknowledge. But your question was very pragmatical, and it's something that I can understand very well. It's very different. It's a complicated religion, and we need to see things in front of us. Just like our professor said when she showed you those images of the people that are punished. They're punished because they cheat when they go to buy alevri.
Flour.
So milk.
Milk.
When they go
Milk.
to the milk to
Yeah.
And I thank our speaker because she gave a very sentimental picture of Asinou, and I understand how deeply you love Byzantine Cypriot art and how you incorporate it in the big Constantinopolitan and Jerusalem history of art, the Byzantine. And I think this is something that, at least having read what you wrote about medieval Famagusta and your Byzantine studies, and we owe you a lot, and we thank you a lot for
Yes.
doing all that for us, and we really deeply appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you again, Anna,
the
for your
thanks are really
contribution.
mine.
I mean,
Really.
these are, our iconic Islam and no images in mosques. And if you come from the religious point of view, of course, why so many Panagias?
You know, the religion of Islam doesn't allow to draw pictures.
That's why we don't have Petro.
Yeah.
They took them away.
That's why we don't have too much conferences about the mosques.
We should.
We
We
should.
should.
We should.
And we should have more conferences
Architecture,
on churches. Yeah.
We should learn.
And
Going back to the
Asinou.
iconography, the pictures were for the local population to understand this life and the next life. But I was struck by the fact that there were long inscriptions with them. And so made me start wondering about levels of literacy in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. Who was reading the inscriptions and who was just looking at the pictures? In medieval Europe, you had the wall paintings because people couldn't read. So what about the inscriptions? Can
That
you
is,
tell me
again,
anything about them?
were they illegible in that height?
No.
Yeah.
Very
very small.
Yeah.
I think
that really is such a great question, because we ponder this a lot, because obviously the Byzantines do seem to have been somewhat more literate on the whole than the Latins, just because they were a strongly bureaucratic state, and the amount of correspondence, which is attested by the lead seals that survive in archaeological finds, indicate that a lot of and any officer in the army had to be literate, and he had to make reports. But still, the population was not literate, and these things are the devil themselves to read in the light conditions that exist in these churches. But I think that in a lot of cases, people would hear these read to them by the clergy, and they probably could ask, what is that? And certainly there is a degree of respect for the sheer presence of word, just the sheer presence of word or even letter has a kind of weight.
Yeah. It reinforced the religion of the book in a way.
Right. Yeah. But I think that the people who do particularly work on the poetry in Byzantium are really curious about the transmission of those texts. How it works.
So if I may just ask one more, I noticed the word hippos, but that's not the medieval Greek word for a horse. Kabalos is the medieval Greek word for a horse.
Kavalos, this is Latin.
No.
Latin.
Diogenes Acritas, all his horses are kabalos.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Diogenes Acritas.
No.
Have you read Diogenes
Oh,
Acritas?
yes. Mavros tu.
Yeah.
Yeah. He seldomly talks about. He rides cavallato mavron tu.
Ναι.
Ο μαύρος του.
Δεν είναι γουαλίδος.
Καβαλάτο μαύρον του Διγέννης Ακρίτας και οι Ακρίτες.
Okay, I may be wrong.
Who the Akrites were? The Akrites were the people from the Amanon mountain, right? So the mountain between Turkey and Syria today.
Yeah.
So these are the Mardites. These are the guys, the Akritiki, the poetry from the Akrites. You can join in.
Yeah, well,
I mean, this.
But I think there also is the factor that a literate Byzantine will use an ancient word if he possibly can.
Hippos and cavallos.
Byzantic, you mean including Romans?
I think that Rome
different, isn't it?
And
Byzantic,
Istanbul,
Constantinopolis.
Right. Well, yes. You see, one of the things.
Byzantini.
This is daha önceydi tabii.
Romania, okay.
Romania.
Romania as well.
Bizans.
That's the old word.
And there is this.
Το όνομα του Κωνσταντινούπολη.
Byzantieni amane χώρισαν η Ρωμαϊκή Αυτοκρατορία.
Ναι.
Και η Ανατολική έγινε Βυζάντιο και η Δυτική έγινε η Ευρώπη.
Έγινε Βυζάντιο σημαίνει, κοίταξε, συγγνώμη δηλαδή, Βυζαντινό, when we say Byzance, it's the name of Istanbul, Constantinople.
But
it was long before Byzance.
Το Βυζάντιο ήταν μια μικρή πόλη.
But since Constantine the Great,
it actually is a German
since Constantine the Great, the city was renamed, and until 1922, the city had the name Constantinople. Constantine in Ottoman.
They used
Byzance for the city. Yeah.
Yes, when they used the word Byzantine.
You wanted to say it's Romans.
Yeah.
the writers, as I know, the writers, the intellectuals used
Ich hoffe, du
to
hast
use
Zeit, dass wir zum Essen gehen.
Byzantine
Bisschen Zeit. Ich muss
because of the settlements there
Türken sind
during
offen, aber
the 17th or
38.
ich
18th
kann euch
century.
nicht sagen.
When they formed the so-called Byzantium, it was Roman, Eastern Roman.
Yes.
It was, right. It was the Eastern. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Until to the 18th century.
Eastern and West Rome.
Yes,
you're right.
Eastern Roman.
Divided into
Yes,
parts.
into
One is
one-
Rome and
yes.
one is Constantine. Constantinople.
that's why we call the citizen Rome.
Yeah.
Rome. Roman.
Yeah.
Rome. Roman.
Right. Yeah. But one does have to realize that there also is this major shift in language, which happens by the time of Justinian, that the language of the Eastern Rome is Greek.
Yes, was Greek.
And Byzantium really developed very much its own habits in using Greek. They're very, very sensitive about what you do with Greek. Yeah. Well,
Okay, thank you very much for contributors, speaker, and thank you very much for you all for coming. And I think we should continue here with church conferences, and on your side with mosques are also important. In my village, my village fellows ask me why you are interested in this church, not in our late Ottoman mosque. They are also very interesting. They can be marvelous. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and you can have more opportunity to talk with our speakers. We would go nearby to a restaurant, which is, would you like to say this? Restoranın yeri. Neydi adı? Galata. Nasıl gidiyor? Buradan çıkınca small fish restaurant is just open. Not very chic like the house here, but I'm told that it's very good one. Okay.
Do you remember how you discovered the world around you? Can you hear the beat of life? Can you hear it by seeing it and feeling with all your senses? Hey, can you still hear it? There's something in you, driving you, calling you. Calling you in closer and closer. It's happening right now. Time to free your curiosity that's always in you. Now it's time to act. This is an act of discovery. It requires looking into the world in new ways. To answer for, but we're not offering you the answers. We are here to encourage your questions, but more important than the question is how you answer it. Try the ordinary, then try the unusual. To live is learn, and to learn is to live. Live, learn. It's an endless process. This is your path. This is your journey. You decide how it's going to be. Just enjoy every moment of it. We believe in design, keeping it simple but also significant. We believe in art for looking at the world with a unique perspective. We believe in creativity for communicating better with the world. Creativity takes courage. The future belongs to the curious. Come and